here. My name is Brian Kirz. I'll be the moderator for today's panel. I'm one of the members of the Accessibility Subcommittee of the GSA's Early Career Leadership Program, who organized today's workshop. Many of you are here. Thank all of you very much for your hard work. Today's discussion is going to be pretty loosely structured. I'm going to start off with some questions for the panelists, and then later on we'll move into some audience questions, which you can type in the chat. And then they'll be curated by our team, who will send them to me to field them. So I'd like to get us started by having our wonderful panelists introduce themselves. In a minute or two, can each of you say a little bit about your background, where you're calling in from, and why you're joining us today? Dr. Merritt and Koko, would you like to start us off?
Yeah. My name's Koko. I'm a student at Laurentian University. This summer, I'm working with Dr. Merritt in his lab, and I will continue my master program under his supervision next September.
So my name's Thomas Merritt. I'm a professor at Laurentian University. I've been a professor for 18 years. For the last 17 years, I've run an accessible sport program. So I actually know Koko because he was an athlete with me in a rowing program and has now joined my lab as a master's student. Unfortunately, what you can't see is that Koko is in a wheelchair. So we are here because we're working together to figure out how to make my inaccessible fly lab an accessible fly lab.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dr. Jacob, would you like to pick up where they left off?
Sure. Hi, my name is Bonnie Jacob. I'm from Rochester Institute of Technology and specifically National Technical Institute for the Deaf. My own background is in mathematics, to be honest. So sometimes in other fields, such as genetics or just the biomedical world in general, I'm a little bit out of place. But one part of my job, other than research, is directing a biomedical science training program supported by the NIH. Our student is called Bridges to the Doctorate, Rochester Bridges to the Doctorate, and our students are all deaf or hard of hearing, and so that's been a fabulous experience, and hopefully I can make some comments today relating to that will be of use to somebody.
Thank you very much. Tori, would you like to round us off?
Absolutely. And I would like to highlight that, thank you for inviting me. And I know Dr. Jacob because of my affiliation as someone who's deaf or hard of hearing in the program that she was referring to. So I'm happy to talk about accessibility in that regard. So I'm currently hard to believe, going into my 5th year of the PhD program in neuroscience at the University of Rochester. And just because of the accessibility aspect, I am someone who uses captioning as well as interpreting services. I'm happy to talk about what scenarios that I use those services in, because I do have a cochlear implant, so I'm able to speak for myself. But just in regard to research, I am working with individuals with schizophrenia, and my thesis just wants to understand, what's going on in the brain when people are engaging in treadmill walking, and perhaps that could help with, the inhibition for schizophrenia. So that's very exciting, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to digging more into the programs that you're a part of later on in the talk, and I think everyone here can learn something from each of you and the programs you've been involved with. So I'd like to start off by going back to the title of today's workshop, which is Improving Accessibility in the Postgraduate Pipeline. And we've invited you to share your experiences and perspectives on that transition. So not necessarily defining it, but to each of you, what is your relationship to that pipeline? What is your experience, been tracing through time, and what would you like to leave the audience members with at the end of today's hour? Bonnie, would you like to start?
Okay. So, that's heavy. I guess I used to run an RAU, and so I guess there was sort of the undergraduate part of the pipeline, and now the Bridges program. In that program, we work primarily with, exclusively with MS degree seeking students who are whose goal it is to receive a PhD in the biomedical sciences. So I've worked on sort of those two parts of the pipeline. I guess sometimes, I mean, this is a funny thing to say, because I mean, I'm so thrilled to be here, and this is such an honor, and I'm excited about this. And there is, diversifying the sciences and making sure more people have the opportunity to participate as researchers and in the sciences is tremendously important. Sometimes I wonder about the pipeline analogy, just because when we're talking about people with diverse backgrounds, and I'm speaking very broadly here, for many people, I think, like a pipeline is so straight and it gets you right there. It's supposed to be continuous, and breaks in it are a bad thing. And I think for many people, including myself in many ways, even though I'm a hearing white scientist, it's not always so simple. And finding ways to embrace a more meandering trajectory sometimes, I think, is important, and recognize that a straight path isn't always the right choice for anybody, really, and to support that and not penalize people for it, I think, is important. So that's something that's kind of lately important to me, and I think will in some ways help to encourage diversity. But hopefully, I'm hoping today we can talk more about being open to people of many different backgrounds, including people with invisible or not so visible disabilities as well.
Thank you so much, and we'll definitely get right back to that. I love the adjustment of the metaphor. Tori, since you were sort of also adjacent to the pipeline in Rochester, would you like to continue talking about your relationship to sort of the process that you've gone through and the perspective that you want to bring?
Absolutely, and Bonnie sort of hinted at it as well. There's no straight path. When I think back to when I was an undergraduate student, I was very focused on wanting to go into medical school. And the reason for it was just because of a child and otolaryngologist, and I fell in love with the cochlear implant surgeries. But I realized that I had a hard time being in scenarios in the medical field outside of the operating room. So that's where I decided, like, okay, I love science from a giant lens view. Science is so broad. So what niche can I find myself into? And that's ultimately what led into me enrolling in the Bridges program. And so I decided to see what the research side of otolaryngology would be like. But I was lacking that human contact. And so it sort of, what really led to where I'm at, to put a long story short, is after the Bridges program, I didn't get into PhD programs the first time, but I knew I wanted to reapply, and I just needed a little more time to figure out my niche. And it's okay, to have some down days. I was half applying to jobs, and I was also half reaching out to the connections I made. And I almost did not send this email. And I'm so glad I did, because the one email I sent ended up leading to a position in a lab that I worked in. And that lab is the reason why I stayed at the University of Rochester to do the research that I do now. And, I just fell in love with it. So it's kind of, even though I never thought I would see myself in research, just trying to keep your mind as open as you can. And I cannot emphasize the importance of networking as much as I can, because, going back to the diversifying it, and, disabilities are not always obvious. Sometimes they're invisible, as Bonnie was saying. So it's just important to be open-minded and understanding that, people have different backgrounds, but also trying to be inclusive in your space. And we can go a little more in depth later about what I mean by inclusivity. So just networking as much as you can.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's such, I think, a great example of the meandering thing that Bonnie wanted to add to the pipeline metaphor. So I really appreciate that. Dr. Merritt and Koko, would you like to talk about sort of the process, by which you met, and the pipeline that has sort of existed or not existed for you?
Okay, so please, Thomas is much better than Dr. Merritt. So Koko and I met because there are not that many people that run an accessible sport program in Sudbury, Ontario. So when Koko came here as a student in a wheelchair, who has a sport background, I was told to chat with Koko. So, you know, maybe this speaks to the networking. As a professor, I think typically traditionally we're told to keep our private lives to ourselves, and we're in the classroom, you're in the classroom. As an able-bodied, middle-aged, middle-class, straight white guy, it's easy for me to bring things into the classroom because I rarely get attacked for anything. So I've been very open about running a parasport program for almost 20 years. So we were actually introduced because of parasport, and Koko is very open about his history in sport. So that's led to 2 years of coaching back and forth. And then when Koko was looking for a summer lab position, that translated into joining the lab. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So as Thomas said, I met him because of sports. And when I was looking for a lab to join, when I started my undergrad program, I read his research field, like evolutionary genetic. I say, this field gonna be very difficult. I don't want to do it, but I can do research, I can do sport with him. And when I got, it taught me one class. I love his class. And when I finished my program, I was looking for getting to med school. I applied for first time. I didn't get in. And when I approached him, he said, I have a position for a master program. I said, I will continue. And since I did very good with the classes that you taught, and you are a good coach, I think you will be a good supervisor as well. and since I was afraid for the first time when I read his research focus, like evolutionary genetic, it was something that I said it might be very tough, but things are made very easy with flies and how he handled teaching. Everything's going very smoothly, and my fear has gone, and I'm ready to start the journey, continue the journey with him.
So unfortunately, one of the punchlines is that although sport does not do a great job with accessibility, sport does a better job with accessibility than a lot of academics. So there's been a bigger push to be involved with accessible sport over the last 2 decades than there's been to be involved with accessible academics. I had been coaching an accessible rowing program for 5 years before we started talking about accessibility in the laboratory. And one of my better colleagues flat out told me, you cannot be a blind chemist. And I was like, you know, where is this coming from? I mean, this is a very good faculty member who's known for being mentoring and has shepherded unknown hundreds of female students into science by her mere presence in science. But she was completely comfortable telling me that you cannot be visually impaired in a chemist. I mean, I understand that people think this. The fact that you would say this out loud as part of a faculty meeting was just stunning. So unfortunately, that's where we're sort of at with accessibility in academics. Sport, we've been doing a better job. And so in the almost 2 decades that I've coached accessible sport, I've been curious as to what accessibility would look in the laboratory, and we've got a chance to explore that. But I don't know that we would have had this chance if sport hadn't made that bridge. We're still not at the point where academics is as welcoming as it should be, certainly, but even as welcoming as sport.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as it says, like if you have a good skill in teaching scientists, you can transfer those skills in daily life, in activity, extra curriculum activity, like Thomas has been doing, and it's worked very well. And that's what I use to find my way in research and continue my postgraduate education.
Thank you so much. I think that's a fantastic way to open this up. I mean, we touched on so much. We'll get back to mentorship. We'll get back to sports as a pipeline. I'm first of all, I'm really glad that we are sort of looking at we have both pairs here, and we're sort of looking at this problem from multiple different angles and multiple different considerations. I wanted to, Thomas, you briefly touched on the state of the field as it exists. I wanted to ask the faculty here sort of a PI's historical perspective on the last 20 years from your perspective of accessibility in higher education, and kind of put the situation on the ground as it is in context. So what did the college to postgraduate pipeline look like 2 decades ago for accessibility issues that each of you are familiar with, and how would you characterize it now? Bonnie, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I graduated from college myself about 20 years ago, and at the time was not really involved in STEM much, and didn't sort of join this kind of effort until probably about a decade ago. But coincidentally, I've been doing some homework just related to another project and looking sort of at the history of some of these NIH-funded training grants for scientists, well, for underrepresented scientists in general. And a lot of those have been around sort of close to their current form for 20 to 25 years, like the ones that are similar to what I run, I think, but many of them were created without a thought towards accessibility. I think that they were thinking about maybe students of color or women, and it was only later that other programs were like, said, well, what about people with disabilities, for example, so that's more recent. And I think with these kind of programs maturing, it's a good thing. They've been around a while, and I think students that have worked their way through the pipeline and have graduated and become, researchers or faculty or PIs themselves are really the people who are making things happen. But I'm surprised to see on the ground, like over the last decade, when I go to conferences with students, especially sort of national mainstream research conferences, I'm always a little surprised at how naive sometimes people can be, and some people will ask. I had a group of students who were all deaf, and we came in, and the interpreter was interpreting the talks that were going on at this one conference, and somebody came up to me later and said, "Well, what are they doing back there? Are they practicing?" And I was like, "No, they're listening to the talks too." But it was kind of good he asked, because then it starts a conversation, and other people who are really well-meaning. I think Thomas mentioned something about, sometimes these great faculty who are really into diversity. One woman approached me, and I think she's wonderful, but she was thinking I could come to her program with students, and without interpreters or anything, I could just kind of help them understand what was going on. I was like, well, I'm happy to come, but I'm not going to be, you need an interpreter, or some sort of access services. So, I think it's great that the most important thing is that people are talking about it. I think probably the people who are here attending are the kind of people who have interests and are also proactive about going out and seeing what can we do. And I think that's hugely important. So it's great to see people asking questions and talking and going to things. And after that particular professor who made that slightly misguided offer, was sort of a champion for efforts like this. So I think, went out and she could educate people. But sometimes it's a little surprising to see, even though many programs for underrepresented students have been around such a long time, my immediate landscape when I go to research conferences doesn't look that different to me. But hopefully that will change. And I think people like Tori and Koko are probably going to make it change. So not to put any pressure.
And you as well, right? Like I really appreciate having everyone from the audience here, and I think one of the things that your story really illustrates is that these changes happen in aggregate. It's all at the personal level ultimately, and it can happen really quickly. And people who who are not exposed to this and don't have it in mind and don't have it in their considerations, it really can flip from one year to the next. So hopefully this is this is part of that process of taking people sort of into a better place when we all join at these conferences together. Thomas, what about you? What do you see as sort of the most significant gains in improving accessibility for students, and do you see any missed opportunities in the development? What are the biggest issues that remain? Is there any low hanging fruit that you can't believe people aren't implementing? What do you think?
Those are all really good points. And there are a lot of different points. So I can only give you my perspective. Like I work on the genetics of stress using the fruit fly model. I don't have a background, promoting diversity. I just am involved with diverse programs. The first time that I ran into one of these challenges was in the late 1990s, probably 97-ish kind of. I was asked to teach an REU course for a group of undergrads from across the US who were in South Carolina for the summer. And honestly, I was asked to teach it because none of the faculty wanted to do it. And so they just sort of pawned it off on a grad student. But it gave me a really great opportunity to teach a course for the summer. One of the students was profoundly deaf. And so they came in with a set of necessary accommodations. And over the course of the summer, I think we were able to get an interpreter once. And that was it. So, most of the rest of the time, either the student would read notes or would lip read. And I mean, this wasn't something I could fix. I was a PhD student who was asked at the last minute to teach a course. But the approach that was taken by the university was, well, we tried. And that was the best we could do. Jump ahead 20 years, I was giving a series of talks for the province on accessibility and my sport program. And we were at, I think it was 8 different cities in 9 weeks. And we always had an interpreter, but it was always a scramble to get an interpreter. That was the 1 week link for every week's event was, were we going to have an interpreter? Was the interpreter going to show up? So, there's a 20-year gap between those two, and it's exactly the same question or the same challenge. So, you always want to say that things are getting better and we're approaching things, a point that was made earlier, asking these questions, pointing these things out. I think in 1997, it was more a matter of shock that if somebody would want to join a science program who had profound hearing impairment. In 2015, when I was giving those talks to the province, I think it was more just a frustration that we didn't have the infrastructure yet to address something that had been identified or, an issue that had been identified. So one point that I don't think that we should miss is the idea of accessibility and improving accessibility across whether it's physical, neurological disability or differences in ability doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so Bonnie made the comment about there have been a series of programs along the way, and then we have them in Canada too for Indigenous people, for people of color. I think the push for that kind of inclusion does help the push for things like physical disabilities or different types of neurology. It's certainly not a perfect system, but I think in general, we're becoming more attuned to the idea of diversity broadly, and that's helping all of the facets of that, whether it's bringing Indigenous students into the lab or people with physical disabilities. It's embarrassing that 30 years, at least from my point, for 30 years of my career into this, we're not further along. But at least at this point, I don't think we're going backwards. I think we are still moving forward, just not at the pace that maybe we'd expect.
I really appreciate how you connected sort of accessibility and kind of the broader awareness that's been happening recently surrounding inclusivity and how those interact with each other. The distinction being that as you said, a lot of the time it may not even be a willingness problem or an awareness problem. It's an infrastructure problem, right? It's about having programs in place, people, interpreting agencies that you can contact, right? Or even like the physical infrastructure of the lab itself, as you were actively figuring out. So I think that's really an interesting, unique dimension to this particular topic that makes it connected, but also distinct from a lot of the other lenses through which you could sort of see the question of inclusivity. I wanted to turn it back to the students, on this idea of the infrastructure and willingness, and recognizing that for a lot of students, especially those such as yourselves who are kind of beyond a lot of where the infrastructure exists to support your journeys. A lot of that accessibility support comes through your own dogged self-advocacy. So in addition to sort of a broader picture of the experiences that you brought into academia, which Tori, you talked a little bit about in your earlier, I wanted to sort of have you share with the audience what are the most impactful forms of support that you did receive, and also what are the kinds of support that you did not receive that if you had would have made the largest positive impact on you. Tori, would you like to start us off?
Absolutely. And I had two thoughts that came to mind just from this dialogue. So the first one was, it's surprising. I'm in Rochester, New York, and we do have the highest deaf per capita in the USA. But when I was a graduate student and I was taking courses over at the University of Rochester, they did not have a real-time captionist. So real-time captionist is someone who can be in the room with you creating the captions rather than, coming through Zoom and whatnot. And there's a lot of technical issues that can happen, especially in a discussion-based, journal club course, for example. And so there was someone at the staff level over at the University of Rochester, and I was surprised there was quite some resistance that I didn't expect. And ultimately I was told, there's this microphone you can be able to put in the middle of a table, and that will allow the captionist to be able to hear. It was advertised that the captionist would be able to hear a bag of chips open, which was not the case. The microphone just wasn't picking up what I needed to be able to get the captions and be able to engage in the discussions like I wanted. So, here I am in class having to troubleshoot. But the reason why I share that is this individual, the staff member, also was saying how the microphone worked great for others who were deaf, but why didn't it work for me? And I think that really highlights the importance of, it's an individualized experience. Not everyone who's deaf or, so forth has the same level of needs. So it's really important to be very clear about it. And, I did want an in-person captionist from the get-go, but I had to be able to compromise, and sort of show that this was something that, wasn't going to work for me. And then we were able to make the collaboration and get an in-person captionist for the coming class I had in the spring semester. But, again, it's sort of, putting the cart before the horse. It's a little hard to, work with that. But another second layer I would like to add to it, a thought that I had is, we do have the ADA, and people would automatically, assume that's, great, you're required by law to provide these access services. But sometimes, that's not always the case. And just from an international perspective, I'm not sure if we have international folks in the audience, but I did take a study abroad trip through NTID, the Technical Institute for the Deaf, and we went to Italy, and we were learning a lot about the experiences of deaf people over there. And I was just really blown away because it almost seemed like the services in Italy at the time were 20 years behind. So there weren't as many interpreters. If you were to make a phone call, you would have to wait an hour just because there were only 4 people in the same room who were interpreting these calls for the entire country. So it was just pretty, eye-opening. So even though we're making this progress, it would be much, better if we were a little quicker along, but it does, fall on self-advocacy. And when I was deciding between the University of Rochester and WashU in St. Louis, University of Rochester does have a handful of deaf and hard of hearing people in PhD programs because of, the programs Bonnie mentioned, the Rochester Bridges to the Doctorate. And that's why representation was so important, because when you have that support, then you can sort of go out and make these things happen. But I did sometimes wonder, sometimes it might be, easier to go to university, but then you could set the infrastructure up yourself because you would be the first one to sort of build that path. So lots of thoughts on that. I hope I'm starting to ramble here, but I hope I answered your question.
No, this is great. Koko, I absolutely feel free to jump in here as well. Both on that topic about the forms of support that you did receive that were the most impactful, and the support that you really wished you had. And I'd also like to sort of open up another can of worms based on what you said, Tori, having to do with sort of the there are universal lessons on accessibility that can apply to students of any age, especially the ADA is not specifically designed to support this particular chunk of people's lives, just because there aren't a lot of people sort of doing it, and that's where those infrastructure problems can arise from a lot of the time. I was interested in your perspectives on the unique aspects of the graduate school experience that pose a particular challenge from an accessibility perspective, and what can be done to improve that, both from the perspective of a policy standpoint, but also an interpersonal standpoint, for example, from the perspective of someone in the audience.
Yeah, thank you. It's a kind of very difficult exercise for me. I'm doing my third undergrad. All my 2 other undergrads was back in my country in Africa. It was very, very difficult. Like, I can have class upstairs, no stair. I have to scroll, go through the stair to go to class. Sometimes I don't go to class because it's very difficult to access those classrooms. And for physical disability like mine, the most important thing is to rearrange the environment I'm in to fit in and to be able to do everything. And when I start my undergrad at Laurentian, I got my first USA, and I was at Northam in the laboratory in Northam. When I get there, everybody was aware that the lab was not accessible. I say, what? I can move everywhere. The lab is very large. Let's say there is no button to open the door. I say, oh, okay. It's like, for me, it's difficult to say that nothing is done, but I have to think backward, like follow the evolution of people with disability rights, their need to be fulfilled. And my first experience with the USR at Northam was really interesting because they use my disability to improve the environment. Thing that was very good. I was very happy that I could have the institute improve the accessibility for the future person coming in wheelchair. It's the same thing with Thomas Lab. When I joined the lab, I look at the environment. Sometimes I have had time turning my wheelchair, and right away we have been thinking about how to make the rearrangement so that I can move. He did that today. His office is very compact. Before coming for the meeting, you rearrange everything. I was happy to move, going everywhere. It's a good, very important adaptation for my traveling. And it's something that I'm very happy to work on and change things, and how other person that will come in wheelchair like me will be able to build up and use what has been done to move on.
Brian, is it okay if I build on that?
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead.
So one of the things that we say in accessible sport is there is almost nothing that we do to make our sport more accessible that doesn't benefit everybody in that sport program. So when I started the rowing program in 2007, the first thing we did was put ramps onto the dock. In hindsight, it seems amazing, but we used to carry 64-foot, 8-person boats down
the stairs,
down a set of steps. So, I mean, these boats are 64 feet long, and they weigh, I mean, they don't weigh a lot. They're actually relatively light, but they're super, and most of our rowers are 40 plus, and that's being generous. Many of them are 60, 70 plus. So we had this hazard, but because we could walk down the steps, we're like, oh, you know what, it's fine. And then with the first 2 athletes that were in wheelchairs, we ramped, and I got an apology from the guy who built the ramps because it took him 2 days to build the ramps. So
Wow.
people want to do the right thing if you can show them simply how to do that. And so we got Bob to go to the city, who then approved, and we put in these 2 ramps in 48 hours. And suddenly we go from walking down a set of steps to walking down a ramp onto the dock. Everybody's access to rowing was improved. So when Koko joined the lab like a month and a half ago, the first thing we did was clear paths so that Koko can turn his wheelchair and get in and out. But it also improved just everybody's access. Like, my lab's 17 years old. We'd let things sort of encroach in, and it wasn't the healthiest environment for moving around, and we've been doing better with that. We do fly genetics. It's not particularly dangerous. The most dangerous thing that we do is we make fly food, which involves boiling 20 gallons-ish kind of this really thick agar. And so Koko asked, would it be okay if we set this up so he didn't have to lift it over his head? I'm like, yeah, that seems like a really straightforward request. So we've got a set of ramps that are being built. We've got a desk on order that will allow us to drop the desk height so that Koko can work more safely with the food. But it's also making us think about how should everybody be working with that food in a more safe manner, right? So it's all sort of part and parcel. Yeah. I will say it's taking longer to do that than I would have liked. So Koko's been in the lab for 6 weeks. We just got a work order put in last week. And it's going to take 3 weeks for that infrastructure to change. So it's not an overnight fix, but everybody involved, I think, has been pretty interactive to get your opinion.
Yeah. They listen to what I need. They consider my opinion, my idea, to make it fit, to make it be sustainable. So I like my participation in this change that we want to bring to the lab.
Yeah, I think that improvisational spirit is really inspiring, and you touched on 2 fantastic lessons there. I think which is that, number one, it's something that's going to help everyone going forward, and we often don't even recognize that things can be done in a better way until we have an opportunity to to improve the accessibility situation in a way that helps everyone. But also that responsiveness is all, for people in the audience, responsiveness of these institutions, even if that infrastructure doesn't exist in place, the immediate responsiveness, the immediate action is really important in fostering, the environment, not just on a policy level, but also making people feel like they're cared about. Thomas, I'm so glad that you brought up the sports involvement and made that connection, because the next thing I wanted to do as I bring it back to faculty was allowing the PIs to talk a little bit more in detail about the work they've been involved with outside of just the peer teaching. So Bonnie, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the fantastic Bridges to the Doctorate program and some of the lessons that you've learned, potential issues that you've run into, and your experience being on the front lines of making a program like that. What's been your experience, and what would you say to someone who is interested in starting up something like that at any scale?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you, Brian. I was too nervous at the beginning to say this, but thank you to you and all the organizers for the opportunity to be here, because it's really great, and it's nice to talk about our program too. So I've run Bridges officially for about 2 years now, and in the middle of that, it changed mechanisms with the NIH and stuff. So I feel very new. So in some ways, I haven't had the time to have a tremendous amount of experiences, although I have had the opportunity to meet alumni like Tori, which has been absolutely wonderful, because seeing students go on and succeed and do amazing things just makes it all worth it. So I guess that's the first thing I'd say to somebody who's thinking about starting a program like that. It's just, it's so rewarding seeing students move through and go beyond. It's just the best. There's nothing better than that. But so our program, I guess, a little bit more concretely, is tailored to students who are deaf or hard of hearing, deaf or hard of hearing students. And it's for master's degree seeking students, although we're kind of part of a broader pipeline in Rochester that consists of URISE, which is also an NIH funded program, and that's for undergraduate students. Then we have us for MS degree seeking students. And there's also Tori knows more about all these things than I do, but there's a program called PrEP for post-baccalaureate students, a one-year program. That's over at the University of Rochester. And we have, there's even a postdoc program now and a program for PhD students. Some of those are more broad, it's not just for deaf students, but there's a particular, at least sub-focus on deaf and hard of hearing students. But I guess some of the challenges that we've faced with the mechanisms changing through the NIH, it's really, there's less money in the grants now, so supporting the students adequately can be a real challenge. And I know that's my problem. That's the nitty gritty every day. So it's not something I should whine about here, because it in some ways it doesn't really matter, but it does in the sense, when we support people and when we really want them to succeed, we have to put our money where our mouth is. And when you don't have adequate staffing and stuff, things fall between the cracks. But I guess one real, I don't know if I would call it a success yet, but one real learning experience that I think has been fantastic for me to learn, and that we're growing on, is seeing the diversity of deaf and hard of hearing students. It's definitely not one student, as both Tori and Koko talked about, like focusing on a person's individual needs really matters. And then it can often benefit everyone. Like at Zoom meetings, only one person talking at a time, for example, somebody pointed out, well, as a deaf person, I can't look at two things at once. But when I started trying to implement that, even with mixed groups, even with hearing groups or groups with mixed languages, mixed hearing, I was surprised to find, hey, hearing people can't focus on one thing or more than one thing at a time either. We just have the benefit of, oh, there's a noise, now I'll pay attention to that. So that's one thing I've seen. We have students in our program who have low vision, who are deafblind, and sometimes it's like, oh my goodness, what are we gonna do? This is hard, and it's scary sometimes. But the benefits students who have other forms of disability or other access needs, the benefits that they have brought to our program are tremendous if we take the time and the resources to listen and make adaptations. And that's one positive I found. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, I love the point of.
May I interject?
Go ahead. I have one more question
Please,
for all of our panelists, and then I'll head into the audience questions section. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. I love the example of how and driving home how these changes can benefit everyone. But I also think that I'm glad you brought up funding, because I think that's a great lesson. We can have all the right intentions, we can have all the right people in the correct places from a policy standpoint, working on this kind of thing, trying to build the infrastructure. But if there aren't enough resources allocated, it still can't happen. So thanks so much for bringing that up again. I had one last question before I handed it off to the audience. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat, and then my trustee team will sort of curate them, and we'll develop a list of questions that I can field. But I and this is open to all of the panelists today. But I wanted to make sure that we covered our bases, in the sense that a lot of the people in the audience today work in universities, but that's not the only community that people can become a part of after graduation. GSC being a great example. So if we set universities aside for a moment and focus on other postgraduate academic institutions that students are likely to interact with, I'd love to hear your perspectives on what kind of unique challenges and opportunities for improving accessibility exist. Thomas, did you raise your hand there?
Yeah, just real quick before we leave the idea of the advantages of accessibility sort of spilling over into everything. So
Sure.
one of the examples that one of the things that I was taught early on in my coaching is to be very conscious of your physical proximity. So as an able-bodied person, I'm a couple of feet taller than many of the athletes that I worked with. So Koko's in a wheelchair, about a third of the athletes that I've coached in a wheelchair. So early on, I was instructed, just to be really conscious of that. And when you're coaching an athlete, make sure you're coaching at eye level. So you're not standing over the athlete, which is actually a really important point. And if you're somebody in a wheelchair, this is a constant life thing that you're generally looking up at people. And this was driven home. One of the athletes that I coached is before he was paralyzed, he was 6'4". And after he was rowing with me, he went to med school, he got a standing wheelchair. And I went in to talk to Steve, and in his standing wheelchair, he's 6'7". And so in my entire professional interaction with Steve, he was more like sort of, chest height. And then suddenly I'm looking up at Steve, and it sort of drove home like, oh, this is a really weird dynamic. So I've taken that, and when I'm working with an athlete who's in a wheelchair, I sit down to chat with him. But I've taken that out into just the classroom, and I realize that if I'm standing over students who are sitting, there's a power dynamic there, and I need to be really conscious of how I'm more conscious of where the students are physically, and I'm interacting with them in a way that's respectful. If they're sitting, I'm sitting. If they're standing, I'm standing. So this is something that I learned from my coaching that I took outside of the coaching scenario and into the classroom. And I think it makes it easier for students to talk to me because I'm aware of that dynamic that's pronounced in a wheelchair interaction, but is there all around or all the time. One of the first athletes that I coached, this guy, Peter Morel, is in Ottawa, and he refers to those of us that are walking around as temporarily able-bodied. And his point is that at some point, your able-bodiedness is likely to decline, if nothing else, just when you age. And his point was that the things that he was helping me learn from my accessible coaching were going to be important to me as my mobility and my able-bodiedness changed through time. So I've tried to learn from that, and these simple lessons like how do you physically interact with the athletes that I'm coaching, bring those into the classroom, into a mentoring capacity. So I didn't want to lose that because I think it's an important way that we can think about what we learn in accessibility, helping us work with all students, not just the student researchers that have a disability.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's another great example. It's something that's going to happen to all of us. I'd like to transition into the audience question section. If you have a question, you can post it in the chat. I will try to get through all of them. I'm not sure if I'll be able to, but I think we'll have enough to round out the meeting. So thank you so much. The first question is about lab infrastructure and designs. Thomas, you have a lot of hands-on experience with this, and the question is, do you think there is a need for occupational therapists in improving accessibility in infrastructure designs?
So I can address it from my personal experience. The person that I needed to consult to see if my design was correct was Koko. And I will tell you that the way this works is I went to the university and the university came back to me. And if I hadn't thought about the fact that I needed to talk to Koko, they would have been happy to just go back and forth with me. Like if you're a contractor, having a single point of contact is easier than multiple points of contact. And I will tell you, it was not the first thing that occurred to me to speak to Koko. But luckily, in the design process, I thought, I am not the right person. And when I said to our head of facilities, will you talk to Koko? He said, oh, yeah, absolutely. It wasn't a hesitation to talk to the researcher. It was just the lack of recognition that we need to be talking to that specific researcher and get their opinion. So right. In this process, was there anything missing?
No, there is nothing missing. But the thing is, when we discuss and we find out what we need to bring in to improve, in my perspective, I always think about financial resources, like what we can bring that will not be too costly. Yeah. So, for example, for the lab, what I'm worried about, like how to take things at the top of the shift. So what kind of accessibility tools I will need to be very independent in the lab.
That's right.
Yeah, like I sometimes on Sunday or on Saturday, I need to come alone in the lab to work. And when I need to take something at the top of the shift, if I don't wear my braces, it's totally impossible to reach out things at the top. But if I have my braces, sit in my wheelchair, I can try to stand up, reach the Thomas height and reach what you can reach. But it's like kind of too many steps to go through, stand up, lock my braces, be balanced, reach, stretch my hand. It's really, really difficult. Yeah. So if I can have something that will facilitate my movement, go at the skill level, that might be fantastic. So talking with people who is in the need can provide the clear idea what is needed for the improvement in the lab.
So, Tori, you mentioned that somebody told you this should work for you, it worked for somebody else. And that's a real issue that we run into with accommodations, that there is a misconception that simply because this accessibility, this works for somebody, it should work for everybody. Or, we put the effort in, and so that's okay. When Koko and I have been talking about modifying the lab to work better for Koko, we're thinking about it in terms of this particular scientist, but also other scientists. Maybe the 4th, 5th year I was here, I had an undergraduate in the lab that was particularly short. And it never occurred to me that there were some issues in the lab until I came in and found a step stool in the fly kitchen. And they couldn't stand up high enough to see into the cook pot to know what the state of the food was. And so they had gone out on their own and gotten a step stool. I needed to have paid more attention to the fact that Christine was not very tall. And so, there's a certain just vision that can be missing until you're challenged. What I think every university needs is a senior administrator in a wheelchair, because it is so hard to get anybody to pay attention to accessibility unless you have some direct contact. I see accessibility different because for 17 years I've worked with athletes that need to, where are the steps? What's the shortest point from A to B? The last parking spot to be plowed in every space I've been is the accessible spot. Worse, on campus here, because of the corner, the snowplows push all the snow into that corner spot. And so they create a glacier in the accessible spot. If my university president was in a wheelchair, there is no way that they would fill the accessible parking spot with a snowblower. Right. So, right. And, short of going out and actively putting people in wheelchairs, I don't know what the solution is, but we would have a more accessible academic landscape if we had more academics that needed accessibility accommodation.
Absolutely. With the university, in your experiences, and this is open to all of you panelists, one question asked what to do when students are denied accommodations, and the administration and Office of Disability have made the situation worse or not helped, and how do you approach finding funding for those infrastructure changes? If there are any tips that you can give audience members who are interested in doing something similar and advocating in their own workplaces.
If I can add, this is Tori here. I think the best thing to do is to go high up when you're doing these actionable items. I was talking about the staff member I engaged with earlier, and things weren't quite working. My PI is chair of neuroscience. I'm in Dr. John Fox at Friedman's lab, and that has been largely resourceful, because if there is a situation where a service is denied, the higher up you go, the more likely you are to get the support you need. it takes time, so that's just quicker as well. So something to consider. As far as funding goes, when I asked this question in a course that I took, and to my understanding, you can budget in your grant, especially for me as someone who's deaf and will have my own lab someday. I do need these access services, so that's something that I would budget in my grant to be able to get the funds for. But thankfully, usually when you're in an academic setting, people understand the need for diversity and representation, all the things that we've been talking about, so that the fundings come from the graduate education and postdoctoral affairs. But because, and that's for all PhD programs in the medical center, but because I was on a T32 grant, that was able to fund my accommodations. And then my lab ultimately funded those accommodations. But to my understanding, that's not quite standardized, so the sources can come from different areas. So it's just something to consider, but hope that helps the people.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think that was an anonymous question, so whoever asked that question in the audience, I'm sure, Tori, you'd be open to them, reaching out to you after the meeting for more specifics on the accommodation needs through funding or PI faculty grants. I know we're almost at time, but I wanted to give our wonderful panelists a huge thank you and an opportunity for them to touch on anything that we haven't covered today, or leave any parting thoughts for the audience.
So one point real quick. When we reached out to the university to rebuild the lab to make sure it was accessible to Koko, there was absolutely no pushback on funding. They said 100% we will do that. So in my experience in academics, the issue is the individual faculty, not the university. And honestly, from a realistic point of view, it's not that the universities are particularly fair-minded. They just don't want to get in trouble. And so they understand that there are repercussions to limiting accessibility, whereas faculty sometimes are a bit more narrow-minded about that. But if you can convince a faculty member to work with you, my experience has been the administration wants to look like they are doing the right thing and will be helpful with accessibility.
Thank you. Bonnie or Tori, is there anything you'd like to say before I close out?
I think we're politely waiting for each other, but I just, everybody's shared such great information. It's been an honor to be here today. So thank you.
Well, I just wanted to say, Thomas, it's nice to meet a fellow Canadian. Koko, I love you already. I actually got my PhD in 1989 before there was any talk of EDI, when that wasn't a term. I'm a worm geneticist. And unfortunately, due to the lack of lab accessibilities, I've faced an awful lot of challenges trying to stay in a research stream. But fortunately, I found that teaching was where I belonged. And I've been teaching at an undergraduate university in Vancouver for almost 30 years. And it's not just if the president's in a wheelchair that the snow doesn't go into the disabled spots. It's if people who are already there, who are supported by their colleagues to have a voice, and I have a very strong voice in my institution, they don't put snow in my parking spot anymore. So it's not just if the president, it's if everybody keeps their eyes open for things that need to be fixed, and everybody speaks up on behalf of those people who need it, not just the people who need it themselves, who are exhausted from self-advocacy. So it's everybody's job. It just shows that people don't really get that there are disabled scientists, and we need a lot more. There's no role models for most of our students. And so I've been privileged to be a role model, but there needs to be a lot more of us out there. So that's what I've been dying to say.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I see there are a couple more questions. Unfortunately, we're a little bit over time, so I'm gonna call it there. I'm sure you can. Our panelists will be happy for you to reach out to them outside of this. As Anne-Marie said, thank you so much for being a part of this event. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining. We really appreciate having you here. And I think that this is another fantastic step forward in terms of improving not just the lives of students with disabilities in this postgraduate pipeline, but also everyone else who's going to benefit from the changes that we make. So thank you very much to everybody, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Brian and all.